Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here. I hope you're happy, healthy and well. It's time for a new book review today where I share some life lessons out of books that I have been reading. Today I'd like to talk about this book, Nightingale, by Australian author Laura Elvery. This is her debut novel. It is about Nightingale, that is Florence Nightingale, the nurse. Now, I picked this up at the library, as you can see, and I was waitlisted. I waited for people before me to read the book, and when I got the book, I read it within a few days. The reason I chose this book is because I had read the reviews and there was a lot of positive reviews on it. So I thought I may as well read it. I usually don't like to read debut novel authors simply because I feel at times the writing is difficult or they're still trying to find their voice, and I like to go back to their books after they've written a few books. But this was enough to intrigue me, even though I did find the writing difficult as I thought. Some of you might think, okay, well, Helen, what is it about? Then we'll talk about the writing style, and then I'll talk about some life lessons and some overall themes. And you can decide whether or not to read this book. Also come up with your own assumptions about what is happening and why it was happening. We are introduced to Florence Nightingale in this book in the very first chapter. She's a very old and frail nightingale. It's 1910, it's London, she's in her London home, she's being looked after by her own nurse, Mabel, who knows a little bit about Florence Nightingale and her background. It is in the voice of Florence Nightingale, and she's talking to us, the reader, about her life, and also talking about the ghosts that visit her, the ghosts that come in from the ceilings and from the walls. And we can assume that those ghosts are the ghosts of the men, the soldiers, who had died in her care many years ago when she was in the Crimean War, in the hospitals there looking after the wounded. One day she gets this visit from a ghost. We read it as a ghost because he claimed to have known her 55 years ago and he was still looking young. So you had to kind of leave your incredulous thinking at the side and assume that it was a ghost. And he comes to Florence Nightingale and he says, "What did Jean Frawley do to me?" And so this was the start of this story, and it was intriguing enough to make me keep reading. What did Jean Frawley do to Silas? And so this book really is three different perspectives of Jean Frawley, another nurse, one of the Nightingales that was under the management of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War. There was Silas, who was the ghost, also Florence Nightingale. So three different voices, three different time periods, and all these voices then are telling us the story of their background, how did it get to that point, and in particular, what did Jean Frawley do to Silas? Comes out that Silas and Jean Frawley had a one-night love affair. They met and in one night they made love, but then he had to go off and she went off to become a nurse. The next time they meet, as you can understand, she's in a hospital and lo and behold, guess who comes up wounded? And she does something that is enough for Florence Nightingale to get her out of the hospital. And I won't share what she does. So it's a story of what Jean Frawley does to Silas, her lover, someone she never had forgotten. The story and the perspective of Florence Nightingale looking at Jean and looking at Silas and then coming up with her own reasons for the demons that she had and the reasoning she had as to why she was that certain person in the hospital. So automatically, given that this channel is about life lessons from books, I started to think, well, what are kind of life lessons I get from this one? Because the writing style was a little bit different to just reading a story and getting immersed into a story and dialogue and plot lines. It was three different perspectives and three different places, and you kind of get it pulled together at different times to understand what was going on. It's written in like a dreamlike sequence or a dream state. The writing is actually quite lyrical, quite prosy. So if you like that stuff, you might enjoy this one. If you don't, I'd say keep away from it. Ultimately, it had enough to keep me going because it broke some of the assumptions that I had about Florence Nightingale and this concept of a nurse being someone who is caring, empathetic, soft, kind-hearted. In this book, Florence Nightingale doesn't come across as that. So automatically, it broke that very first assumption I had about Florence Nightingale, who, ashamedly, I would say, I don't know much about her. I know she was a Lady of the Lamp, but I don't know why or what war she was. I even got the wrong war that she was in. But anyway, that's my own failing of not educating myself as to who she was. So the first life lesson for me was thinking about this role of a carer and how we assumed that a role of a carer takes on someone who's kind-hearted and caring and empathetic. And it is the same very question that Florence Nightingale has when she looked at Jean Frawley, who was her nurse, who was kind, caring, loving, empathetic, soft-hearted, kind, and just did her actions through love, whereas Florence Nightingale didn't. Florence Nightingale in this book really struck me as someone who was a stickler for rules. She was very strict and pedantic about the rules. She made these rules up for the benefit, knowing that if you don't follow the rules, there's going to be a lack of hygiene, a lack of sanitation, which means more death. So she is a stickler for the rules, and she comes across as also being quite ambitious. But you can reason as to why she is a stickler for the rules and being ambitious, because she is one of the first nurses who needs to have those rules in order for more men to stay alive, in order for those conditions to be followed, and in order for there to be less deaths. But at the same time, she starts to think, well, you know, Jean Frawley, on the other hand, has done something that was so caring and empathetic. Maybe Florence Nightingale should have been something like that too. So there was this interesting balance of carers being who are carers, and why people who are leading carers also need to be a little bit more standoffish, need to be a little bit more strict when dealing with, without losing their humanity and empathy in the process. My second life lesson for me was this concept of, it's not a concept, it's actually true to life, is the fact that in the early 1800s, it would have been very difficult for women who were unmarried, so the single women. I mean, what choice did they have? They could be a spinster, to be looked after by their brothers, to be hoisted away in some room or some attic or some house by the seaside, their days forgotten, or to become a nun, or what else? Be a nurse. So you saw that single women, and in particular single women who came from rich backgrounds and single women who came from poor backgrounds, had very different options. This was interesting because I wasn't aware that Florence Nightingale had come from a very rich background. The reason why she had gone into nursing was that she was also someone who, her father supported his daughters in being educated, whereas Jean Frawley, on the other hand, who was a motivated nurse who didn't really know much about nursing, but she was willing to learn. But she came from a very, very poor background where she had instances of hunger and starvation in her life, and yet she was still someone who had a lot of empathy and humanity for her fellow human beings. So the two questions of women in different care roles, but also the backgrounds that they come from, was very interesting. The third instance of this was me thinking about, well, what happens if there's a book like this and you're finding it very hard to read? What is it that you do to keep on going with it? Well, I would say for me, it was exploring a little bit more about the life of Florence Nightingale. I even tried to look into the life of Jean Frawley if it was based on a true story, but no. I had to check my mind, especially with regards to the ghost element to it. So I kind of had to have my realism set aside for the time. So I would say that if you're struggling with a book, but it has enough to intrigue you to keep going, keep going with it, knuckle down and continue reading with it, because it'll bring out some questions afterwards. It also made me think of a couple of other books that I had read quite recently about the role of women in the 1800s. Those couple of books that you might be interested are Emma Donohue's Learned by Heart, which is one I recently read, and also Remarkable Creatures by Tracy Chevalier, which is another review I did quite recently, so feel free to check that out. So that's my review and life lessons of Nightingale by Australian author Laura Elvery. If you've read this book, let me know what you think. If you've read any other books, any novels about Florence Nightingale, let me know what they are in the comments below, because I'd be interested in reading more about Florence Nightingale. There was a lot I didn't know, but at the same time, I'm going to say that this book is it's fictionalized. My assumptions about who she was as a person really don't stem from this book, but it really brings up the themes about women in care, women in caring roles, and how single women take on the role of a carer at some stage in their life, and also the differences between women who came from different backgrounds with regards to rich or poor. So that's it for now. Thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Bye for now.